A few months after my novel Open City was published, a book which was in part about the limitations of vision and which actually contained an extended passage. My narrator was a doctor, an extended passage about the blind spot, which he compared to the practice of psychiatry. A few months after the book came out, in April of 2011, I woke up one morning and I was blind in one eye. I had lost vision on my left eye. I went to one doctor, sent me to another doctor, and one doctor after the other. And I finally ended up at New York Eye and Ear Infirmary, the top specialist hospital for eye problems. And then I was passed through a succession of residents and doctors until I was finally, and nobody could figure out what was going on. I wasn't in pain, I just couldn't see. They thought maybe I had detached my retina, but that was not the case. And then I ended up with the top retinal specialist who examined me and said, you have a fairly rare condition. It hits young people, and it's called papillophlebitis, also known as big blind spot syndrome, which I thought was a bit on the nose, given the obsessions in my work. I had laser surgery, but also it was caused by bleeding on my retina, so that when your whole retina, the blood vessels were exploding, and when your whole retina is full of blood, well, all you see is a field of gray. But anyway, my vision was restored. But, and then I had a little bit of problem with my right eye as well, and then a year later I had this. And the doctor was like, well, we don't know what causes it, and there's really no cure for it, and it'll probably happen again. Thanks, doc. But, there are two things that I emerged from that with. One was, well, blind spot, I guess, I have to think about that even more. But the other thing was that as a photographer, my looking really changed. It really did become sacred. Sort of this intensity of looking at the world and looking really closely and photographing things that were not exciting, but things that were sort of washed with presence and with light. And over the years that followed, I compiled this project. As a younger photographer, it was all about the decisive moment. And now it really became about the moment that was being held in one's attention. And that's how this project came to pass. Lagos. On the other side of the church from where the man sleeps on a table are two graves by a wall. They are tiled, as graves in Nigeria sometimes are, one of them in black, the other in blue bath tiles. I have seen both baths and graves done up in this style. As though to underscore the balneal theme, among the detritus between the two graves is a disused bathtub and an orange plastic bucket of the kind often found in Nigerian bathrooms. At the end of Book 10 of the Iliad, Odysseus and Diomedes spend a long night killing Thracians. Quote, and the men themselves waded into the sea and washed off the dense sweat from shin and shoulder and thigh. Afterwards, when the surf of the sea had rinsed the dense running sweat away from all their skin and the inward heart had been cooled to refreshment, they stepped into the bathtubs, smooth polished, and bathed there. End quote. The overlap between the grave, the bath, the bed. Strategic escapes from the burden of verticality. And lying down without even thinking about it, you close your eyes. Bathtubs smooth polished, Homer writes. Later on, Andromache draws a hot bath for her husband, Hector, who, she doesn't know this, is already dead. Hector, who is already dead and isn't coming home to take a bath. So I was just really interested in figuring out what kinds of conversation you could have between pictures and images. One of my main jobs, one of my main gigs is that I'm a photography critic. And so that's one way in which I talk over pictures. But I'm also a photographer. And I found that when I came to my own images, I didn't want to talk over them in the same way that I might write an essay about a set of pictures for the New York Times or something. What I found I wanted to do was something more like voiceovers, something that was certainly engaging with the image, but engaging with it in a way that was independent also, so that we had the words and we had the image, and then a third thing could happen where they met each other. So this book is sort of like 150 of those pairings around the idea of a blind spot. It's not an explanation of the picture you're looking at. But it is also, honestly, when I scanned all these photos were taken with film, I scanned the negative and I was looking at the pictures, and I took this one, I started to really look at it. Well, this is a fair version of the thoughts I was having as I looked at this picture. So, American right-wingers like to say about freedom, they say, freedom ain't free. In other words, we have to go to other countries and do war crimes in order to stay free at home. My version of that is free association ain't free. So we talk about, oh, that's free association, but there has to be an internal engine that keeps it coherent and somehow sensible to itself. So this is a book about the limitations of vision. When we're looking at the world, which is what photography is, we're looking at the world and we're registering what has been seen. When we're looking at the world, there's so much that we're missing. There's very often a story behind the story, either behind the act of photography or behind the life of the photographer or in the terrain in which the image is being made. And this is what this book is. It's just saying, I can take a fairly small number of themes, and over the course of the book, I'm weaving them together, trying to be free, but also weaving them together in a kind of a densely stitched way. So already in this passage, so many of my preoccupations come to the fore. Closing the eyes, a form of temporary blindness when you sleep. But also the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Bible are the three texts I keep going back to in this book. The Bible, theology, not because, I believe, I don't believe in the Christian God. I obviously believe in the Greek gods because you don't want to accidentally get up, die, and then find out that Zeus is in charge. And then you've spent your life not believing in him, But really the approach, the interest there is that even in our post-modern and largely irreligious age, we need language. We need the help that language can give us. And you're not going to find that language in more concentrated form than you find in ancient texts, because they were very clear about what they were about, These days, anyone can tweet, but back then, before you wrote the text down and it survived several generations, it had to have concentrated something necessary for human insight. And so that when we go back there now, it can still help us a great deal. So that's why I relied on such things so much for the construction of this book. Color is the sound an object makes in response to light. Objects don't speak unless spoken to. An object does not have a color it makes a color the way a bell makes a sound. Sound is molecular motion. Color, too, is molecular motion. Color is the selective absorption and emission of light on the surface of an object. As an untouched drum makes no sound, an object in total darkness has no color. A photograph full of muted but complicated color is similar to a full orchestra playing a quiet passage, powerful resources used to create a subtle effect. With my eyes, I begin to hear what I see. I would never, want to be Swiss. I mean, no offense. But the beauty of it is that they don't want me to be Swiss either. I mean, I don't know if you know Switzerland. So we're doing great. I go there every year. I love being there. Switzerland is my far away from here. I love being up in the Alps, far away from everything, all alone. Great infrastructure for tourism. There are many things I like about it. And I love the feeling of not being in Switzerland and longing for it. A feeling that I enjoy all through the year until I go there. And then I enjoy being there, but then I start itching to be far away from it again so that I can long for it. The opposite of Heimweh is Fernweh, the desire to be far away from here. And I grew up in hot, flat, crowded, noisy Lagos, Nigeria. So being up in the Alps in Graubünden is the opposite of everything I've ever known. So it's pure heaven for me. Writing and making images, both of them are a process of going around the world, finding what belongs to you. There's a hunter-gatherer aspect to it. Your radar is up, both visually and anecdotally and narratively, for the things that are part of your project. And it takes years to figure out what's yours. Mm-hmm. But then your instinct becomes quite good for what is yours. And then you gather, and then when you come to making the work or editing, it becomes a question of selection, So it's not a question of making the images and trying to find words that go with them, or writing the stories and trying to find it, but more like matchmaking. Everything is in a kind of primordial archival state. And then when things join each other in a convincing way, Mm-hmm. So I had 10,000 negatives. Sasabe, far from the city, through narrow darkness, through scrub forests and rocky cliffs, our elder brother brought us across. His name was Iitoi. On our setting out from the other side, he turned us into ants. He brought us through narrow darkness and out at Babo Kivari Peak into this land. Here we became human again, and our elder brother rested in a cave on Babo Kivari. And there he rests till this day, helping us. The land is a maze. You have to be guided through. Right from the beginning, you had to be guided. The first story in the world is about safe passage. An iron fence spirals into the distance, enforcing on the land a separation in the mind. In the grass near the inspection post at Sasabe, on the Mexican side, someone has planted 2 white crosses. The large one lists at a 60-degree angle. On the smaller one, you can see the word mujeres. The code is made of wounds. Photography is a different kind of miracle, which is that you can't go back and fix it. You can't go back and do it. You have to take it in that moment. Yeah. And then it emerges as a kind of collaboration with what is given by the world. Mm-hmm. Okay. Which is why, for me, my photographs that I like best actually make me happier than my writing that I like best. Because in my writing that I like best, I still sort of get congratulated for being smart. Uh-huh. And in my photographs that I like best, what people say is, nice photo. What camera did you use? In other words, I could take that picture too if only I knew what camera you used. And I like this sense of separation from it, even if they never could, it almost makes it as if you and I are in the presence of a third thing, And meanwhile, with writing, there's a much more opportunity for ego there. Vancouver. On the longest day of my life, I traveled across both the equator and the international dateline, arriving like a weird traveler at the beginning of a day I had nearly ended already. I was on unceded indigenous land belonging to the Coast Salish peoples, the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. In the water beyond, around Vancouver Island, a whale-watching ship had sunk the previous week and 5 people had drowned. The city glowed like an undersea creature, my first night there, my day ending for the second time that day. Zurich. I sat there for hours and watched the sun slip across the landscape. Anything can happen. The point is to shatter serenity, the absurdity of contrast between before and after is the very point. The work that has a longer finish to it, is more lasting in a way, has to have something in it that is slowing it down, that's slowing down the spin. And that could be you're deciding to shoot with film, that could be you're deciding to shoot with an uncomfortable camera, that could mean that you're deciding to shoot only with your iPhone, which gives you sort of a lower quality. It's more versatile, but then there are actually many different decisions you could make, but what's important is that somehow you're doing something that rescues you from the very seductive cheapness of image making. Which is the ambition of every artist, so that you can break through to something that has a chance to console somebody else. Capri. Later on, I thought of the catalogue of ships in the Iliad. I could not tell over the multitude of them, nor name them, not if I had 10 tongues and 10 mouths, not if I had a voice never to be broken and a heart of bronze within me, not unless the muses of Olympia, daughters of Zeus of the Aegis, remembered all those who came beneath Ilion. But that was literary, that came later. On the day itself, on the evening of the morning on which I opened up the window of my room to see the apparition of a shining fleet on the Mediterranean, what I thought of was what Edna O'Brien said to those of us in the audience. We know about these beautiful waters that have death in them. Copenhagen. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." At the Nye Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen is a photograph of a Catholic procession in rural southern Italy. Next to it is a high marble relief of a Roman ritual procession from around the time of the Arapachis. It depicts a number of women in profile. Between the relief sculpture and the photograph is the museum's russet wall, split so that which section is in front and which is behind is hard to read. The relief sculpture looks, in fact, like a photograph of a sculpture, and it is difficult to resolve into its three-dimensional form. The women from the 1st century BCE are on the verge of crossing the Red Sea and joining their distant Italian daughters and sons. But what was strange about this picture was, looking all the rolls of films I took on this trip, this was the one, this was the weird one, a picture that's hard to read and make sense of. But suddenly, the background becomes a factor. It becomes real. The background becomes the Red Sea. And it's the same thing we do in photography that we do in writing, which is we make work in the hope that it'll somehow outdistance us and tell us something we did not see, even when we were making it. And I sort of knew what I was doing when I took this picture, but what I could not have seen when I took the picture was the flatness of the sculpture. And when I scanned the negative and I saw that flatness, I said, this is what I want to think with. Brienzer See. I opened my eyes. What lay before me looked like the sound of the Alp horn at the beginning of the final movement of Brahms's First Symphony. This was the sound. This was the sound I saw. Brahms was traveling on his way from Germany. He's from Hamburg, on his way to Vienna, where he spent the rest of his life. He spent some time in Switzerland, and he heard them playing the Alp horn. And that's what gave him the inspiration for the opening of that fanfare at the final movement of his First Symphony. And when I looked at this, that's what I heard mentally. But I sort of compressed it into this, and this was the sound I saw. Not only is it a moment of synesthesia, it's also a reference to a photography book by Roy DeCarava, an important American photographer who had a book about Harlem and jazz called The Sound I Saw. So for each of these, I always try to have an implied page of footnotes that are not explicitly stated, and this is maybe the most compressed of all of them.
You don't want to state it directly that go look it up or go listen to this song, but it's sort of implied that we either know it or if we don't, never mind, we'll just get something else out of the picture.
Well, I'm not a poet, but I love what they do, and I love how they can compress as a way of creating emotion, you know. And for any good, really strong poem, there is an implied set of end notes that we don't know about. The moment you have an actual human being in a picture, very quickly it settles on a meaning, because then you read the expression. If there's a picture of somebody smiling, it's very hard to read that as something other than a picture of happiness. If I have a picture of a room, I can think with the room. If I have a picture of a room and there's somebody on this side who is going like this, then it immediately becomes a picture of frustration or melancholy or something. So the human presence has a way of activating and foreclosing the possibilities. So I tended to avoid it. I also think that objects and scenarios and landscapes speak to us. They remind us of things. They create a kind of tension that opens up interpretation of various things. Pictures of pictures, pictures of globes, pictures of maps, pictures of words, pictures of landscapes, but that look as if they are not pictures of ordinary landscapes, that look as if they are pictures of pictures, or maybe this funnel is just in front of a poster, or maybe this funnel is actually truly in front of mountains. So there's a synesthetic property as well. I'm always looking for photographs that remind us of other senses. Brazzaville. Darkness is not empty. While preparing this book, I rescanned the negative of the boy by the Congo. His eyes disappear, I had written. But all of a sudden, with slightly altered settings, I could now see his face, his eyes. Darkness is not empty. It is information at rest. Late in the 19th century, after hundreds of years of pressure by the European colonists, the villages in the interior along the Congo River began to succumb to the invaders. In response to this civilizational crisis, mangaka power figures were sculpted ever larger, growing from their miniature sizes to the height of a man. In each village, the mangaka was a sentry to ward off the oncoming collapse, poised to spring into action and intensely reflective. The mangaka was full of potent medicine, with eyes of white metal enamel, irises of iron ore. This boy is double-visioned. He is looking out, looking outward, but here, poised at the edge of the crisis, he's also looking inward, looking in. So this is a photo of a young man I took in Brazzaville, in the Congo. And it shows up early in the book, and I do an extremely dense theological reading of this as a Christ bearer on the river's lip, like St. Christopher, but also St. Veronica, the holy cloth, because of that white, but also like Christ himself carrying the cross on the way to Golgotha, and on like that. I really just sort of went crazy with that. And while I was preparing the book, in my studio, I rescanned all the negatives. And when I rescanned this negative, and I had written this piece, and, at the end it's like, his eyes, he lowers his eyes vanish. To go with my theme of what we cannot see, the blindness. And then when I scanned the negative, this is what I saw. There is work you need to do in the world, especially if you're an artist, especially if you're a creative person. There's something you need to give. There's something you need to put out there. That is a kind of a serious and a kind of a sacred duty. And the work can be serious and it can be lighthearted, but it is almost every artist you talk to has a sense of a calling. There's stuff that needs to be done, Waking up in the morning and you're thinking about that thing you're creating, right? And over time, you end up developing your voice. And then your voice matters because you're giving to the world something it might not otherwise have. And the more I realized that there was some work I needed to put out into the world, the less the actual form of it mattered. What mattered was to listen closely to what wanted to speak into the world through me. And that this is something I could do with a novel, I could do it with fiction, I could do it with essays or with fragmentary writing. It's something I could do with photography, something I could do with painting or with speech or with soundscapes as I'm doing now. But it's also something that can emerge in conversation or in interviews. There's a whole series of themes. There's a certain kind of intensity that has to be sort of tamed. It has to be disciplined, and then it has to be sort of set free so that it can go out and be wild in the world once again. There's a certain kind of embodied freedom that you think that can maybe help other people to be free. So ultimately, if I give all of this up and I just become a dancer, that would be fine. It's really not about the form. It's about expressiveness. I mean, this is why Anne Carson is at this festival, and she might be in this room, maybe she here. But Anne, if you're listening to whether or not she's here, but Anne Carson is one of my literary heroes because of that emphasis on freedom, a freedom that's accompanied by this sort of ferocious discipline. And I don't know what her next book is going to be because it could be anything,
Are you talking about your next one?
No, her. Well, I certainly don't know what my next book is going to be either. But I don't know what hers is going to be. I'm not relying on her to produce a product. But I'm relying on her to continue to be free. And I think that is a place where some people actually have to live. I feel very fortunate that that's where I live.